Okay, so our first session, setting the scene, just so you know where we are, the first session is on setting the scene. The second session, we will be looking at the issue of justification by faith, a key issue of the Reformation. In the third session, after lunch, we'll be thinking of the authority of the Bible and the authority of the Church, another very key issue of the Reformation. Arguably the key issue of the Reformation. And then in our last session, we will be looking at the role of the sacraments, different attitude to the sacraments on the part of the Roman Catholics and Protestants. So we start with a little bit about the history. And why this conference? Well, this is what we've already had answered for us. Thank you very much. Yes. So this year is what is known as, there's a movement known as Reformation 500, because this is the 500th anniversary, as you all know, of the great event of the 31st of October 1517. In which, in that evening, Luther went and nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg. Or did he? Well, that's not quite so sure. Apparently, the first reference actually to him nailing them up doesn't come till 1543. Certainly, he wrote the 95 Theses, and he sent them off to the bishop. Archbishop that day to raise the questions. Whether he actually put them up on the door isn't completely certain, but well, it's a convenient story, even if it isn't actually the strict literal truth. But let's assume for a moment he did pin it up. If he did, it wasn't some great act of defiance. I don't know if you've come across this, but I've come across this being described as his standing up to the whole medieval church and with an act of defiance by nailing it to the door of the castle church. That would, if he'd done that, that would be much more like posting up details of a debate. Academic debates were regular. Luther wrote quite a number of different theses. He'd written 97 theses a few months before, and pinning them up to the door would have been simply a way of saying, we're going to have a debate, and these are the theses we're going to discuss. So it wouldn't have been an act of defiance, it would have been an act of introducing an academic debate. But of course, as we know, and Luther didn't, this was going to be more than just an academic debate. This was going to be the trigger that set in place the Reformation, which of course changed the course of European and ultimately world history. So just a bit about the background to the time when Luther was at work. And I've put up 5 characteristics there. First of all, papal absolutism. Papal absolutism. The popes claimed supreme authority in the church. And this had the position of the pope had in fact grown significantly before the time of Luther. In the Middle Ages, there had been, at one point, there were 2 popes. There was a split within the papacy, and that eventually was resolved. And there, again, the councils of the church had tried to assert their authority over the popes, but the popes had managed to face that down. And the popes also had a great rival in the East, the Eastern Orthodox Church, which has never accepted the authority of the Pope. But again, the city of Constantinople, now Istanbul, fell to the Turks in 1453. So the great rival to the Roman Catholic Church was on its knees and under occupation by Muslim Turks. So the papacy seemed supreme at this time. But you know the old maxim, power corrupts, all power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there was considerable corruption in the papacy. Many of the popes around the time of Luther were more concerned with politics, with increasing they came from leading families in Rome and in Italy, and they were more concerned with extending their political control over the territories they ruled and furthering their families. rather than the needs of the church. So it was a very low time for the church. Then corruption amongst the clergy, clerical corruption. There were all sorts of abuses. Simony, where people would pay money to get some spiritual office, and then they would draw the revenues from that. So there's a lot of money in the church, and money also corrupts. Absenteeism, people who were supposedly the vicar of this such and such a church, say, but in fact not doing it. They were drawing the money and paying a small amount of that for somebody else to do it in their place. And an uneducated clergy, in many cases with a lot of ignorance, and preaching. Many churches would have had little or no preaching. So the state of the clergy was quite low. Not necessarily lower than it had been in sort of the immediately preceding centuries, but what was happening in the 16th century is that the expectations were growing. People were expecting more out of the church than they were getting. And then we have popular superstition. There was more interest in reading legends about the saints than the scripture, and by also there was people were more concerned in many cases with the cult of the saints, and so you get people great emphasis on going on pilgrimage to this and that saint, the body of this and that saint, praying to the saints and so on, and Christ and the gospel had been rather marginalized. So there was a lot that needed putting right in that respect. Then scholastic theology. This is another part of the background to the Reformation. Scholasticism was a form of academic theology that developed in the sort of 11th, 12th century, and was what was taught in the universities. And the aim of scholastic theology, scholasticism, was to give a rational account of Christian beliefs. And in many ways, there's a lot to learn from it, and there were many good points about it. But by the time of the Reformation of the 1500, there had come various problems. The role of Scripture. It was said that you could, in some places, you could study theology, do a degree in theology without ever opening a Bible. It was all, in some places, become all about just going over the traditional authorities of the church, and the Bible had been marginalized. Also, when it comes to the area of justification, there was a problem in the way in which late medieval theology had developed. Not everywhere, but there were those who were teaching, and this was Luther's background, this is what Luther was taught as a student, those who were teaching that in order for God to help you, you had to earn His grace. So, and how did you earn God's grace? You did it by doing your very best, by loving God above all else. That's what you were expected to do before God gave you His help. Well, that's not exactly an encouraging message. And Luther found it no help at all to him. And in fact, he found that he hated God because he felt he was under God's judgment. And he felt there's no way he could love God while God was condemning him. So there were problems with some of the forms of late medieval theology. And in fact, that's actually recognized by many Roman Catholic scholars today, and in fact a line that is taken about Luther by many Roman Catholics more recently is that Luther was misled, if you like, by the wrong teaching that was going out at that time, and that the Reformation was a reaction against that. Finally, humanism. Humanism today, when people talk about humanism today, they often talk about a sort of secular humanism, people who have no place for God and so on. Humanism in the 16th century meant something very different indeed. Humanism was a movement which sought to go behind the Middle Ages, back to to what was seen as the golden age of the church, back to the Bible, and also the early church fathers. And there was a considerable movement at that time, the leading figure being Erasmus, a Dutchman, who towers over the 16th century. And most of the reformers were disciples of Erasmus. Most of the reformers were people who had been influenced by Erasmus and his teaching and wanted to go back to the pure sources of the Christian faith, the Bible and the early church fathers. Most of the reformers, the most noteworthy exception is actually Luther, who wasn't so significantly influenced by that, but virtually all the other reformers were influenced by Erasmus's approach. But interestingly, the followers of Erasmus, those who sought this reform of the church, a significant number became Protestant reformers, but also significant numbers were active within the Roman Catholic Church and wanted to see a reform within the structures of the Roman Catholic Church. So that's by way of background. Now let's turn to Luther, our figure for who we're commemorating with this 500th anniversary. And I'm going to be showing you some photographs of these places in just a minute, but my ability with PowerPoint is such that I thought it was simpler just to go through the facts and then put all the photographs afterwards. I'm not quite subtle enough to be able to intermingle the photos, I'm afraid, so I'll have to ask your indulgence on that. Luther was born in 1483 in Eisleben in Saxony, which used to be part of East Germany. And the East Germans, the communist East Germans, went to town on the Luther anniversary, and Maggie and I, together with a colleague and his wife, we went there and went round all these Luther sites in 1983. And some of the pictures you're going to be seeing are from that time. But also this summer I had to be in Wittenberg for a conference and took the opportunity to revisit these sites, so some of the pictures are more recent. So I've been there twice. So Luther went to the University of Erfurt to study law. This is what his father wanted him to do. His father was somebody who was in mining and was going up in the world, and he thought it would be great to have a son who was a lawyer, who could help him with his own legal problems, and lawyers generally are reasonably, do reasonably well. So he had this vision of what his son would be. But his son had a brush with death. He was on his way back to Erfurt from his home, and he was caught in a forest, and there was a thunderstorm, and he was in a panic, and he prayed to one of the saints and said, "Get me out of this and I'll become a monk." And afterwards he had some regrets about that, but he made the promise, and he did, and so he became a monk, or to be more precise, an Augustinian friar at the monastery at Erfurt. And his father was not at all pleased, but had to accept the situation. And then eventually, while he was there, Luther studied theology and became ordained, and he began to lecture at the new University of Wittenberg. And we'll see some pictures of that. He went back for Erfurt for a time, but then he was permanently posted at Wittenberg and became professor of theology there, and remained in Wittenberg until his death. And of course Wittenberg became the great center of the Reformation. Now Luther's conversion, you'll see Luther had spiritual problems. I've described these two already to some extent. He was seeking forgiveness of sins, he wanted assurance of salvation, but he thought the gospel was all about God's righteousness, God righteously condemning us, and he had a big struggle on this, and then through reading the New Testament, through the theology of Augustine, through the help of others, he came to a clearer understanding of what the gospel was and is. So why have I put a question mark after his conversion? Not because I doubt the fact of Luther's conversion, but there's certainly a very big question mark about the date. Exactly when this took place. And indeed, exactly the nature of his conversion, because and did he have one conversion, or did he actually move more than once, to one stage to another stage to another stage? And I can tell you, we're not going to go into that now, but I can tell you, you could fill not just a shelf, but a small library full of books and articles written on this topic. And part of the problem is that Luther wrote an account later in his life which the dates don't seem quite to square with what he's in his writings, and so it's exact chronology and what comes when, it's all a bit controversial, but we don't need to bother about that now. But anyway, the theses, what were the 95 theses about? Well, they were about the issue of indulgences. So what's an indulgence? Okay, it's like this. We're talking now of Roman Catholic theology at the time of Luther and afterwards, in fact. As a Christian, you sin. When you sin, okay, there might be some minor little thing, but if it's something serious, it cuts you off from God. That's what's called a mortal sin. And so, in order to be put right with God, you have to confess. You have to confess your sins to God, but also confess to a priest and go to penance, sacrament of penance, confession. And when you've done that, you'll be forgiven. That's the good news. That means that you're no longer headed for hell, but you owe God satisfaction. You owe God some compensation for the fact that you, as a Christian, have sinned against God. And so you've got to pay off that debt. You have a debt, what they call a temporal punishment. The eternal punishment is hell. You get rid of that by repenting, confessing, and so on. But the temporal punishment remains. And you pay it off by fasting, by paying alms, by going on pilgrimage, going to lots of church services, and so on. You can pay it off like that. But if at the end of your life you haven't paid the debt, then you go to purgatory. And purgatory is the place where you pay off the remaining debt. Now, how long people spent in purgatory, there was no sort of clear answer to that, but I mean, people were thinking sometimes in terms of thousands of years. And to be in purgatory was identical to being in hell, with the way people thought of hell, the literal way of hell in those times. The only difference being that it was temporary. Rather important difference, but still it was not a pleasant place to be. So what are these indulgences? The idea of the indulgence, if you buy a plenary indulgence, this means you are released. Your debt is paid off and you're released. And there was a man called Tetzel, a friar who was going around selling these indulgences. And people were invited to buy them for themselves or for their departed relatives. And so your Aunt Matilda, your Aunt Matilda, you suspected she might be in purgatory. You didn't like the idea of her suffering effectively the pains of hell, even if it wasn't forever. And so there was this offer. You just pay, buy the indulgence, and she'd be set free. And there's a little jingle. As soon as the coin in the coffer clings, the soul from purgatory springs. So that was it. It's that easy. And of course, the trouble was, I've explained it to you that you actually have to repent and so on, and the indulgence only deals with this temporal punishment. But of course, people didn't read that small print, and people thought you could commit the most serious sin in the world, and you just buy an indulgence. Don't need to bother about repenting or anything. You just buy an indulgence, and that'll deal with it. And that, of course, was very seriously misleading people. Well, there was more scandal to do with it as well, because these indulgences were being sold in order to raise money for, there was a man, a very wealthy young man, Albert of Mainz, who was already a bishop of one place, and he wanted to become bishop of another place, despite the fact that he was too young to become a bishop, so he had to pay money in order to buy this privilege. And the indulgences were used to raise that money. And also the indulgences, the money from the indulgences, were going for the building of St. Peter's Church in Rome. So I think next time you see, of course you often see on television pictures of St. Peter's, you know, when the Pope's in the news or something. Next time you see a picture of St. Peter's, or if you go there, just say to yourself, this building is the monument to the Reformation. Because how was it built? By money from indulgences. What was the effect of indulgences? It was precisely to bring about the Reformation. So they got their lovely cathedral, but the price they paid for it was not however many ducats they had to pay the architect, but it was actually the Reformation of the Church. So as I say, it's a monument to the Reformation. Well, the 95 Theses. Luther was concerned, because, as I said, because simple folk had the impression that all they needed to do was to buy these indulgences, and that repentance and so on didn't matter. And Luther was deeply concerned about this, and so he wrote 95 Theses questioning the practice, the way in which indulgences were sold. Now, as a very young Christian, I'm not sure why I did, but I read the 95 Theses, and it actually, in a small way, shook my faith. Because I thought, hang on, I thought this was supposed to be the Reformation. In the 95 Theses, Luther accepts the authority of the Pope. He accepts there's a place called purgatory. He even accepts that he doesn't say there is no place for indulgences. It's a Roman Catholic document, but he's questioning. He's saying, well, you know, if the Pope can set people free from purgatory, why doesn't he just set everybody free? And he's raising questions. But at this stage, he's still very much a Roman Catholic. He's not a Protestant at this stage, but he is beginning to raise the questions, and questions, of course, which are going to lead him much further in a different direction. Now, Luther had written, I mentioned, 97 Theses earlier on. These theses were much more about theology, about the doctrines of grace and so on, but these didn't particularly arise interest. There was a debate, but they didn't really stir up much interest. But the 95 Theses got everything going, because the 95 Theses were actually hitting the papacy where it mattered, hitting the finances. You know, people stopped buying these indulgences, and this was serious because they needed the money. So it's because it affected the money that it was taken so seriously, and the whole process of the Reformation was set underway. Right, I think we should have some pictures now. Yes, this is the house where Luther was born in Eisleben in Eastern Germany and Saxony, and there you see a little statuette of him at the entrance there, and that's just around the side of that building. And there's a nice sort of portrayal of Luther there, with some information on the side. Yes, just a few words about him. This is actually the house where he died, or at least allegedly the house where he died. And that's allegedly the bed where he died. And I jumped from his birth to his death because these two are just a few hundred yards apart. It's an irony. He ended up dying very close to where he was born. Whereas the birth house, don't think anybody questions it. The death house, they now are pretty sure that they got the wrong place. And I was there, as I said, this summer, staying in a hotel which was at number 55 on that street, and they said that it was probably number 55 that he died. So I don't know. I think to myself, you know, maybe the room. I mean, it's obviously been rebuilt more recently. But I thought maybe I was actually almost in the room where he died. I don't know. But of course, they weren't going to change the site, and the old one is the traditional site of Luther's, where Luther died. Yes, that's actually the hotel, and the front entrance of the hotel, which is just a few doors down from the traditional place of his death. Here we have a picture of Erfurt. That's the university, a building from the university where Luther went to, where Luther studied, and that's the friary where he became an Augustinian friar and took his vows. And this is where he would have made his vows as a friar stroke monk, and also where he celebrated Mass for the first time. and there is a little on the, oh no, I'll see if this works. Look, there, oh, sorry, hang on. There, on that spot there, is a place where the priests sat during Mass, and that's the, as I say, the spot where he made his initial vows and first celebrated Mass as a priest. Then he went to Wittenberg, and Wittenberg, that is the Augustinian friary there, and eventually became Luther's home. It's quite a grand place. He didn't just live on his own. They had students to live with them and so on, because he married and had quite a few children, and also had students with them. And this is the castle church. This is the castle church in Wittenberg, and it's on the door of that church that he either did or didn't post the theses. And that is the door, the original door burnt down in a fire some centuries later, but now there are bronze doors with the text of the 95 Theses written on them, replacing the ones that were there in Luther's time. Okay, so let's turn then to the aims and outcomes of the Reformation. Aims and outcomes, because the aims of the Reformation and the outcomes are not actually the same, and it's important to recognize that. So what was the aim of the Reformation? The aim for Luther and the other reformers was to reform the one church, to reform its doctrine, to reform the beliefs of the church, and through that to deal with the corruption in the church. It was not the aim of Luther or the reformers to create a rival church. They didn't say, okay, there's a Roman Catholic Church, we need two churches, we need a Protestant church for those who prefer that. Their aim was to reform the one church. And certainly it was not the aim of the reformers to produce many churches. Luther didn't sit down and think to himself, you know, I can imagine this place in the Far East called Singapore, and wouldn't it be great if they had a Lutheran church and a Methodist church and a Presbyterian church and a Roman Catholic church and Anglican? This would be fantastic, the more the better. Everybody can have what they like. That wasn't the least bit what Luther was thinking. Luther's aim was to reform the one church. So in Saxony, where Luther was, and in Wittenberg being part of Saxony, when the Reformation came, there weren't two churches in Saxony, there was only one church. The Catholic Church in Saxony became the Lutheran Catholic Church, it was a Reformed church. And Calvin, we'll be thinking of Calvin, some of us, next week. Geneva, when the Reformation came to Geneva, the church, the one church, became Reformed. So it was the same building, the same people in it, but it was now reformed in its teaching and its practices. And this was their aim. So the reformers, their hope was that the whole of Europe would accept the Reformation, and there would be one Catholic Church in Europe which would be reformed. That was the aim. Of course, the outcome, as we know, was very different. The outcome was division. First of all, division between Protestant and Roman Catholic. And this happened not in a casual way, it happened despite many attempts to resolve the issues. And I'll be talking in the next session about a serious attempt to resolve the difference when it came to justification and other doctrines. So there were repeated attempts to avoid that. But also division between Protestant and Protestant. And we'll be thinking about that also after lunch. From Luther, we had the rise of Lutheranism. But Luther wasn't the only reformer, and pretty independently of Luther, Zwingli in Switzerland also brought in a Reformation. And from that you have the Reformed movement, which sometimes is called Calvinism. But Zwingli is the one who started the Reformation in Switzerland. So there were already differences between the two, and they fell out over the question of the Lord's Supper. And we'll be thinking of that, a little bit about that in our final session. So the result of the division, particularly between Protestant and Roman Catholic, was the 30 Years' War. There was conflict before then, but the really big event was, it's called the 30 Years' War because it actually lasted 30 years, between 1618 and 48, and it was fought in Germany, and but it was the all the European, well, many of the European states were involved. The Swedes were heavily involved, Austrians, French, and other nations were putting in, providing troops and resources for it. But Germany was the battlefield, and it devastated it and knocked it back for 100 years. And it was a brutal war. Because ideological wars, of course, are always the most brutal ones, because people are fighting for what they believe in. If it's just a war to gain territory, well, then that's can be fairly easily resolved. But when people are fighting, and effectively a civil war, fighting over beliefs, they tend to be the most brutal. Well, one of the outcomes of that was the rise of toleration. Well, we actually go back a little bit earlier than that, before the 30 Years' War. In 1555, the German rulers, now I need to explain what I mean by the German rulers. I use the word Germany, and you're probably thinking of a country like what is known as Germany today. In fact, what was called the Holy Roman Empire, which was mostly Germany, but a bit wider as well, was a collection of many different states. And some of these were city-states. So the city of Strasbourg, which is now in France, was a city-state. Augsburg was a city-state. Saxony, where Luther was rather bigger than just a city, and that was another independent state. The city of Cologne was a city-state, with the Archbishop in control of it. And so if you think of dozens and dozens of separate entities, and all gathered together with a sort of the emperor in charge, who is, well, in charge only in the sense that he's a bit of a figurehead. So these, and every year they meet together in a diet. And you've probably heard of the famous diet of, well, to say it crudely, diet of Worms. It's actually Worms is how the German city is described, where Luther supposedly said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." That was the annual diet where they all gathered together with the emperor. And in 1555, the German rulers gathered together, and they resolved that from now on, each independent state within the Holy Roman Empire could choose its own religion. But it was very limited. They could choose to be Roman Catholic or Lutheran. Those were the only two options. And if the ruler decided to be Roman Catholic, all the citizens were Roman Catholic. If the ruler decided to be Lutheran, all the citizens were Lutherans. So it was toleration for the rulers, no toleration for the citizens. But that was a huge development, because up until that point, there was only one official religion, Roman Catholicism, and the Lutherans have existed for about 30 years or more before this time, before 1555, but they'd had no official status, and now there was this official toleration. In 1648, at the end of the 30 Years' War, there were two big changes. First, and now it was actually three churches. There was the Roman Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, but also the Reformed, the other form of Protestantism. All three were tolerated, and again, it was much more than before, because this was not just the ruler being able to decide. I mean, the ruler still did decide what religion the state would have, but within each state there was now toleration for the others. So in Saxony it would be Lutheran, but there would be toleration for Roman Catholics and Reformed. And so on in different states. So this was a big step in toleration. And toleration continued. Toleration began in Germany, as I say, but it doesn't mean to say it took place everywhere initially, but it did begin to spread elsewhere. But in Roman Catholic countries especially, it still remained true that Protestants still remained under considerable difficulty if they were tolerated at all. So think of a country like Spain, and you couldn't be a Protestant in Spain for a long time after this. Well, what we see with the 30 Years' War in particular is massive bloodshed. As I say, it devastated Germany. It was a horrific war. 30 years is an awful long time. Think the events you've been seeing in Syria, and think about that dragging on for 30 years in one country. And so in the 18th century, with the Enlightenment, you get a reaction against revealed religion. And there are those who begin to say, What we need is not a religion that's based on revelation and leads to people fighting each other, but what we need is more tolerance and a religion based on reason alone. And so this is the main motivation force for the growth of the Enlightenment. And what we've seen ever since then in Europe has been the steady retreat of Christendom, of Europe as Christian Europe. And things have now reached the stage when, a few years ago in 2004, the European Union wrote a proposed constitution. It never happened because 2 countries voted against it, so there was a treaty instead. But in this constitution, there was a bit of an outcry because they didn't even mention Christianity as part of the cultural and religious heritage of Europe. Christianity was simply not mentioned. It talked in general terms about, vague terms about religion, but there wasn't even a mention of Christianity when they were talking about the evolution of European civilization. So that, in a sense, is a bit of a high watermark of the development of the Enlightenment and the retreat from Christendom in Europe. Right, okay, well, there will of course be time, when we come to the end of this lecture, there's some time for questions, and so if things I say strike you as particularly controversial, or you're not sure whether you agree with them or you want more, then store those up and we can discuss those when it comes to the questions. Okay, today's world, because as was ably mentioned in the kind of introduction that I received, today's world is very different from the time of the Reformation. That was in the 16th century. This is the 21st century. What relevance does something that happened in the 16th century have for the 21st century? And so that's the first point to spell out a bit more. The world today is massively different from 1517. And in 1517, it was certainly in Europe and many parts of the world, it was normal for one religion to be imposed on all citizens. So you had a religion, that was a religion of everybody in that state. There are still some countries, I mean, like Saudi Arabia, that is still the official, well, the effective position there, although some people understand there are some Christians in Saudi Arabia who have to keep an extremely low profile. But there still are some countries like that, but that is very much the exception in the modern world. And Singapore is much more typical. Looking around and what I've heard, is very much a culture where there are different religions. I saw on the way on looking at the map as where we were driving, there's a Hindu this and a Buddhist that, and of course there are lots of Christian churches and so on. So this is much more the sort of world we live in. A world of secularism, and also countries and regions are no longer isolated. It's a global world with the internet and easy travel and so on. Luther, I'm sorry to have to say this, Luther had never heard of Singapore. Luther didn't, well, I'm assuming that's the case. In other words, it was a very parochial world where, I mean, the 16th century was the time in which Europeans were moving into, especially the Jesuits moved into places like India and China and Japan and so on. But there was considerable ignorance in one part of the world about another. We live in such a different world in that way. Then different questions. And it's often said, I think it's true, the big difference is in the Reformation, the issue was the justification of man. How can we be justified by God? Whereas for many people in the modern world, not everywhere in the world, but for many people, especially in the developed world, the issue is the other way around. How can God be justified? Theodicy. How can there be a good God in a world of evil? So the questions being asked tend to be very different today. And of course there are big issues today, I presume they're here as well, but certainly in the West especially, issues of equality, issues of gender, and these sort of questions. And then again, high on the agenda for many people, understandably today, are environmental issues in a world of climate change and the threat that poses. So there are all sorts of questions today that are very different from the questions that faced Luther. And the Roman Catholic Church is very different again, as was said in the introduction. The Roman Catholic Church has a very different attitude to Luther now, and they are not, I think I get my words right here, they're not celebrating, but they're commemorating the Reformation. Celebrating would be perhaps a little step too far, but they are commemorating it and joining in events commemorating the Reformation. And so the Roman Catholic Church that today is very different from the one that Luther faced, very different. And a lot has happened in the Roman Catholic Church since Luther. The two big events, if you like, after Luther, you have the Council of Trent, which began just before Luther's death, and it didn't actually last for 18 years. They met in 3 sessions with long intervals in between. But that sought to define Roman Catholic teaching in a clearly anti-Protestant direction. And flowing from that, you have what is either called the Counter-Reformation, countering the Protestant Reformation, or the Catholic Reformation, the reform of the Roman Catholic Church itself. And certainly, many of the, not all, but many of the abuses that the Reformers opposed were dealt with in the Roman Catholic Church after the Reformation was a very different one from the one before. Although doctrinally, there was a mostly reaction against Protestantism. And then, almost exactly 400 years later, you have the Second Vatican Council, in which the Roman Catholic Church opens up now to the modern world and also to the Reformation to some extent. And in the 20th, tying in with Vatican II, in the 20th century, you had a change in Roman Catholic circles in the attitude to Luther. Actually, I think I've got this down for. Oh no, I'm about to come to this, so I'll mention it now. Yeah. Luther, in about, I think in 1904, a Roman Catholic scholar by the name of De Nifla wrote a book about Luther, in which Luther was basically, the view that had been held for many centuries, he was the depraved monk who threw over his vows, who debauched a nun, i.e. got married, and invented this doctrine of justification by faith to justify all his sins. So a somewhat unsympathetic picture. By the 1940s, you have a rather different picture. Luther was a sincere reformer who was misled by the false teaching there was in the Roman Catholic Church at the time of his own studies, and was sadly misled by that to go off into heresy. It wasn't altogether his fault, it was the fault of what the Church had taught at the time, and if he'd only understood the pure milk of Roman Catholic teaching, that none of this would have ever have happened. But then by the end of the 20th century, you have a step beyond that, and Luther comes to be seen as a prophetic figure to whom the Roman Catholic Church needs to listen. And this is brought home to me very vividly some years ago. I was visiting the Catholic Truth Society bookshop. The Catholic Truth Society has tended to be, traditionally, has been a very sort of polemical, anti-Protestant sort of institution. The Catholic Truth Society bookshop at Westminster Cathedral, Roman Catholic Cathedral in London. And there was this book on Luther there. But that wasn't remarkable. What was remarkable was where it was. Now, I wonder if anyone would guess which section of of course you don't know what the sections were, but which section do you think, just have a guess, which section was Luther's book, the book on Luther, to be found? Bestseller. Bestseller? No. Fiction? No. Did I hear someone say that? Begins with an S. No, it was under Saints. So they would have a book on St. Augustine and this, and Luther. That's where they put the book on Luther. Now, I don't think that counts as an official canonization of Luther by the Roman Catholic Church, but it is highly, this wasn't an accident, it wasn't just misshelved. Where do we put this man? And they didn't have I'm not sure if they had a section on heresies, but anyway, that's where he certainly would have been previously. but they had put the book under saints, and that's the Catholic Truth Book Society. So Catholic Truth Society bookshop, I should say, because the Catholic Truth Society has traditionally been the very polemical one. And so in 2017, as I mentioned already, that the Roman Catholic Church is commemorating the Reformation, and the Pope, in connection with that, has called Luther a great reformer. And going back a little bit, the change in attitudes, Pope John the 23rd, the one who called the Second Vatican Council, quite amusing, but he was quite elderly when he was chosen as Pope, and they said to themselves, we'll choose this old man, he'll just keep the shop running for a few years, and then we'll decide which younger man we want to appoint after him. And he was the one who opened the doors, who called the Second Vatican Council, and also he coined the term for Protestants, not wicked heretics, but separated brethren. Brothers and sisters from whom Roman Catholics are separated, but brothers and sisters. And that reflects very much the change of attitude that has been. Going back not that long, I mean 1962, I mean I can see a number of people here who are already alive in 1962. So that's for many of us, within our own lifetimes this has happened, and a dramatic transformation. It's as late as the late 1950s and even possibly early 1960s that there were stories of Protestants being killed in South America, persecution of Protestants in South America, as late as that. The Second Vatican Council introduced massive change, and the whole climate is very different now. Okay, enduring issues. Enduring issues arising from the Reformation, because you might have thought from where we've got to so far that my message was going to be very simple. Yes, the Reformation is over. Hey, don't bother about lunch, let's just have coffee and go. But it's not quite that simple. You'll be perhaps pleased to know, I don't know. First of all, I want to distinguish between hot issues and important issues. Hot issues are the issues that are widely discussed at a particular time. I mentioned a few hot issues from today, like the environment, issues of gender and sexuality and so on. These are hot issues, and they are what are discussed. But hot issues aren't always the same as important issues. Hot issues change from time to time. But and that is the way, incidentally, that theology progresses, and probably other disciplines too. But with theology, a particular issue is in the frame, everybody's discussing it, it gets examined in much more detail, and then the debate moves on. But what has been unearthed in that debate is valuable, and now there's a deeper understanding of that particular doctrine. And people have done this, right? A history of theology, just jumping from, looking at this doctrine in that century and that doctrine in that century, according to when they became the hot issue of the time. So the hot issues change, and that's quite natural and right and proper. But the important issues are not the same thing. And so if you think of the creed, something like the Nicene Creed, you have really fundamental, important issues there, and these are always important, even if they're not the hot issues of the time. They are the abiding issues of prime importance. So the fact that the Reformation, not all the issues of the Reformation may be hot issues today, certainly doesn't mean they're not important issues. Justification by faith, that's a key Reformation issue. Some would see it as the central issue of the Reformation. I'm not sure I agree with that, but we'll think about that next session and the one after. But absolutely, it is an important one, and our next session, as I say, will be on that topic. The topic which I think is ultimately of the greatest significance in the Reformation is the whole question of authority, and that we will consider after lunch. That is the fundamental issue that the Reformation raises, and that remains a fundamental issue at every time. And although the relation between Roman Catholics and Protestants is very different today from what it was in the 16th century, this fundamental issue still remains an important one. And then the relation between faith and the sacraments. That, of course, is something that affects every individual believer. That's something very practical for Christian living. And that is an issue which is also profoundly significant, that is thrown up by the Reformation. And we'll excuse me, consider that in our final session. Now, these issues still remain important today. Justification by faith, the whole question of authority, the Bible and the Church, and the relation between faith and the sacraments. They remain important issues for today, but of course that doesn't mean to say that nothing has changed since the 16th century. It would be quite silly to say that. A lot has changed since the 16th century, but the issues still remain. And again, the other thing to just to point to, these are important issues, but they're not the only issues. Not necessarily even the most important issues in Christian theology, but they are very important issues. I mean, issues of the Trinity and the person of Christ are really fundamental issues, but they were not debated particularly in the Reformation, because Protestant and Roman Catholic, the Reformation was not about that. There wasn't any significant disagreement over those issues. So these issues which we're looking at, they were important then, they were the hot issues then, they are still important today, although, as I say, it doesn't mean to say nothing has changed. And while I'm saying they're important issues, I'm not saying they're the only important issues, or even necessarily the most important issues, but they are certainly important issues.